At some point in the last week, you explained yourself to someone who didn't ask. Not because they demanded an account. Not because the situation required justification, but because the silence felt dangerous. Because the possibility that they might misread you, judge you, withdraw from you was uncomfortable enough that you filled the space with reasons before they had a chance to form the wrong conclusion. You probably didn't notice you were doing it. It has become that automatic. Nietzsche noticed. In Twilight of the Idols, published in 1889, he described the compulsive explainer as someone who has, without recognizing it, handed authority over their own interior life to the audience they keep addressing. Every explanation is a small surrender, a concession that the other person's understanding of you is required for you to feel secure in who you are. And the accumulation of those small surrenders over years of habitual justification produces something that looks like communication but functions like dependence. The genuinely powerful people Nietzsche studied and wrote about shared something that initially reads as arrogance and reveals itself, on closer examination, as something far more interesting. They had developed a relationship with their own judgment that did not require external ratification to remain stable. They acted. They chose. They moved. And the explanation, if it came at all, came long after the action, if it came at all. This video is about understanding why. Not so you can perform mystery, but so you can locate, finally, what has been costing you more than you've been willing to calculate. If you have ever left a conversation feeling diminished by your own attempt to be understood, give this video a like right now, because what follows is going to change what you do the next time you feel the pull toward justification. 1. Explanation is a transaction, and what you're paying is authority. Robert Cialdini's decades of research on influence and persuasions established something about the psychology of information that most people apply everywhere except the one place it matters most: to themselves. His work on the scarcity principle demonstrated that human beings consistently assign more value to what is less available, not only in markets, but in social perception. Access creates value. Restriction creates desirability. What is freely distributed is, almost by definition, worth less than what must be sought. This principle operates with uncomfortable precision inside the social economy of self-disclosure. Every time you explain your reasoning unprompted, you're distributing something that had value precisely because it wasn't yet distributed. You're answering questions nobody asked. You're filling silences that, left unfilled, would have required the other person to engage with you rather than simply receive your account of yourself. What you receive in exchange for the explanation is not understanding. Understanding, when it happens, does not require your explanation as its precondition. What you receive is temporary relief from the discomfort of being potentially misread, purchased at the cost of the authority you surrendered in the transaction. Nietzsche, in Beyond Good and Evil, described this pattern as one of the primary features of what he called the slave type. Not a moral judgment, but a psychological observation. The person whose sense of self is organized around the management of others' perceptions. The slave type explains because explanation is how they maintain the approval on which their internal stability depends. Remove the explanation and the stability wobbles, which is precisely the information the explanation was designed to prevent anyone from having. 2. What powerful people understand about silence that most people don't. Daché Keltner at UC Berkeley has spent years researching the psychology of power, specifically the behavioral and cognitive differences between people who occupy high-power positions and those who don't. One of his most consistent findings concerns what he calls the disinhibition effect. People with genuinely high power are significantly less focused on monitoring and managing others' perceptions of them, not because they're indifferent to how they're received, but because their sense of self does not depend on the reception. The low-power behavioral pattern. hypervigilance about others' responses, continuous monitoring of social feedback, the compulsive management of impressions through explanation and justification, is not a personality trait. It is a structural response to the experience of being in a position where others' judgments carry real consequences for your security. When your stability depends on approval, monitoring approval is rational. But here is what Keltner's research reveals about the transition. The behavior pattern precedes the position. People who develop the internal stability that makes monitoring unnecessary, who build a relationship with their own judgment that doesn't require continuous external validation, begin to carry themselves differently before any external circumstances change. The silence, the stillness, the absence of compulsive justification, these are not the results of power. They are its preconditions. Nietzsche, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, made this argument through Zarathustra's repeated returns to solitude, not as escape, but as the practice through which he maintained a center of gravity that did not shift with the responses of his audience. Zarathustra explains himself when explanation serves a genuine purpose. He does not explain himself to manage how he is received. The distinction between those two things is the entire difference between communication and dependence. 3. The specific cost of explaining yourself to people who have already decided. This is where the compulsion to explain becomes not just costly, but actively counterproductive, and where Nietzsche's framework becomes most practically useful. There is a category of person to whom explanation does not function as information. They have reached their conclusion before the conversation began. What they are doing when they invite your explanation is not opening a question. It is staging an evaluation. And the more thoroughly you explain yourself, the more material you provide for a verdict that was already written. Amy Cuddy's research at Harvard on social perception identified something that maps precisely onto this dynamic: judgments of warmth and competence. The two primary dimensions on which people evaluate each other are formed within seconds of initial contact and updated only with significant difficulty. The narrative a person has constructed about you is not a neutral receptacle waiting to be filled with accurate information. It is an active, interpretive framework that processes new information in relation to the conclusion it has already reached. What this means for your explanation is uncomfortable but clarifying. The most careful, most honest, most thoroughly reasoned account of your reasoning will be received not as new data, but as more evidence for what they already believe. If they have decided you are defensive, your explanation confirms the defensiveness. If they have decided you are calculating, your explanation reveals the calculation. If they have decided you are insecure, your explanation demonstrates the insecurity it was trying to conceal. Nietzsche, in On the Genealogy of Morality, described this as the fundamental problem with performing before an audience that has organized itself around a verdict. The performance does not change the verdict. It becomes part of it, and the person who understands this, who has developed enough clarity about the structure of these interactions to recognize them before investing, stops performing, not out of indifference to being understood, out of the recognition that this particular audience was never going to deliver understanding regardless of how well the performance went. Think about the last time you explained yourself thoroughly to someone and felt, afterward, more misunderstood than before you started. Comment below. My silence is not my weakness. Just that. Because the people who need that sentence have been explaining themselves to the wrong audiences for long enough. 4. The internal architecture that makes not explaining possible. Because the instruction to stop explaining yourself is useless without an understanding of what needs to be in place for the not explaining to be genuine rather than performed. There is a version of not explaining that is simply a different kind of management, the calculated deployment of silence as a social strategy designed to produce the impression of self-possession rather than emerging from it. Nietzsche would have identified this immediately and found it no more admirable than the compulsive explanation it replaced. Strategic silence is still organized around the audience. It is still a performance. It has simply changed the content of what is being performed. The genuine version, the silence that belongs to someone who has actually developed what Nietzsche called sovereignty over themselves, comes from somewhere different. It comes from a relationship with your own judgment that has been tested enough to be trusted. From the experience of having made decisions, lived with their consequences, and discovered that your own assessment of those decisions is more reliable than the consensus of observers who had access only to the surface. Marco Aurelius in Meditations, the private journal of a Roman emperor who spent decades making consequential decisions under continuous external scrutiny, returned again and again to a single distinction: what is in your power and what is not. Your reasoning is in your power. Your choices are in your power. The interpretation of those choices by people who do not have access to your interior is not in your power. And the attempt to control that interpretation through explanation, through justification, through the continuous management of how you are perceived, is the surrender of energy that could be directed toward the thing actually in your power, the quality of the next decision. Epictetus made the same point with characteristic economy. Concern yourself with what is yours. Everything else is noise that you are choosing to treat as signal. This channel exists outside the algorithm. No sponsorships, no brand deals. Just research, writing, and the belief that ideas sharp enough to change how you see yourself are worth protecting. If this is giving you something real, a framework for a habit that has been costing you more than you've calculated, consider supporting this work directly through the link in the description. Every contribution keeps this independent, and that independence is what makes this kind of precision possible. 5. What Nietzsche said power actually looks like from the inside. In Ecce Homo, the autobiographical work written in 1888, Nietzsche described his own relationship to criticism, misreading, and the continuous misrepresentation of his work with a composure that puzzled many of his readers. He was not indifferent to being understood. He wanted deeply to be understood. What he had stopped doing was organizing his behavior around the project of producing understanding in people who were structurally incapable of it. He wrote about the specific freedom that comes from releasing the project of universal comprehensibility, from accepting that certain things you think, certain ways you move through the world, certain choices you make will not be legible to certain audiences, regardless of how thoroughly you explain them. And that this illegibility is not your failure. It is information about the audience. The genuinely powerful person, in Nietzsche's framework, which is less about social dominance than about the sovereignty of a person over their own interior, does not explain themselves for the same reason that someone who knows the time does not consult other people's watches. The reference point is internal. The authority is located in the self rather than distributed across the responses of observers. And the silence that results is not contempt for others' understanding. It is the natural behavior of someone who has found something more reliable to organize around than other people's approval. What this produces socially is worth examining clearly, because it is frequently misread. The person who does not explain themselves is often perceived as arrogant, as cold, as someone who considers themselves above accountability. But accountability and explanation are not the same thing. Accountability means bearing the consequences of your choices, something that the non-explainer does, often more fully than the person who spends their energy managing perceptions of those choices. Explanation is the attempt to control how the consequences are interpreted. These are different projects, and confusing them is one of the ways the compulsion to explain maintains its grip. Now let's close this with what it actually requires. Because the instruction embedded in this video is not simply to stop explaining yourself. That would be too easy, and it would miss the point entirely. The point is this: The compulsion to explain yourself to everyone, at every opportunity, about every significant choice, is a symptom of something that no amount of strategic silence will address. It is the symptom of a self whose stability is still organized around external approval. And that organization cannot be disrupted by changing your behavior without changing what the behavior is organized around. What needs to change is the internal reference point, the question that gets asked before the explanation begins. Not, how will this be received, but, do I trust my own assessment of this? Not, what will they think, but what do I actually think, and is my thinking here reliable? Building that internal reference point is not a single decision. It is a practice. The slow, iterative experience of making choices, living with them, and discovering over time that your own judgment, when genuinely consulted rather than bypassed in the rush to secure external validation, is more trustworthy than you were raised to believe. Nietzsche's most essential philosophical contribution, across the full arc of his work, is the argument that the authority you keep looking for outside yourself was never located there. It was never in the approval of the audience. It was never in the understanding of the person across the table. It has always been in the quality of your own relationship with your own interior, and the explanation habit, whatever else it does, is a way of deferring that relationship, of outsourcing the question of your own validity to people who were never qualified to answer it. 2 questions for the comments. First, what is the situation in your life where the compulsion to explain yourself costs you the most? The relationship or context where you consistently over-justify and consistently feel worse for it afterward. Second, what would you do differently this week if you genuinely trusted your own judgment without requiring anyone else to confirm it first? Leave it below. The specific answers are the ones that reach the people who need them. And if this kind of examination, the patient, honest dismantling of the habits that keep you organized around external approval rather than your own interior, is work you want to continue, subscribe. Because the next video goes directly into the territory this one opened. The person who knows themselves does not need to explain themselves. They simply continue.